it going, guys? So I hope you can hear me. It's a little loud in here. It's always loud in here. Obviously you can see I'm in the Nova today, and like I said in the last video, promised I would show some driving content, so I figured I'd try that out today. Try out the GoPro setup that I haven't used in forever. Show you a little bit what it's like driving this thing around. A lot of noise, a lot of smells. But it's a lot of fun. So I'm just going to be going on a short drive today. Well, a couple drives around town. And give you a little bit of an idea of what this car really means to me personally. I know a lot of people, you know, have a lot of different opinions of old cars or, you know, race cars that aren't nice looking and all that. But this car is a lot of things to me, a lot of different things. And I thought today would be a good day to talk about it. Today is Father's Day. It probably won't be by the time it's posted, but I'm filming this on Father's Day. And my dad was a huge part of how I got this car and why I have this car. I'm gonna fill up some gas and we can get going. All right, now, I know a lot of people talk about, man, I feel like I'm always filling up this car with gas, blah, blah, blah. I literally am always filling up this car with gas because the fuel cell only holds about 8 gallons, 8.5, depending on what it's feeling like. And I have to fill it up every time I drive it, basically. I've run out of gas twice in this car, and I don't ever want to do that again, so I've learned my lesson. Which I guess brings me to my first point. Hopefully that's not too shaky for you. I like this car despite its many, many, many flaws. Flaws in the way it looks, flaws in the way it drives, flaws in the way it operates, flaws in the way it sounds. You know, well, that's going to change with the LS later this year, hopefully, but I still love this car. This is a dream car of mine. I think I've talked about that before in other videos. The fact that I'd wanted a Chevy Nova since I was young, like probably 10, 11 years old maybe. And I got this car when I was 20. And I didn't think that I would own a car that I've dreamed about since I was a kid, you know, before I was even old enough to drink. I still kind of have to pinch myself every now and then, and some people might be like, oh, well, it's not like it's a crazy expensive car and all that. No, but they're actually pretty hard to find, especially in my part of town. They are not very common, which is kind of weird, even though Chevy sold a lot of Chevy Novas. They sold more Novas than Camaros, Chevelles, all that. Well, actually, maybe not Chevelles, because I think Chevelle, the Chevelle was one of Chevy's best-selling cars ever, and the Nova was as well. But if you try to find a third-gen Nova these days, if you go on Craigslist and look, you might actually find more Camaros. And the reason being is, back in the day, this was the equivalent of a Chevy Cruze, or, you know, like a Toyota Corolla. This was the, if you believe it, the compact of the day. This was Chevy's everyday car offering. It was not really meant to be special. You could get an SS with a V8 and all that, yeah, but it wasn't as cool as the Camaro and all that, ultimately. You could get them with a big block. You could get them with, you know, a 4-speed rock crusher, all that. But they still were never in as big of demand, and they still aren't. They don't go for $50,000, $60,000 unless they're really rare, like a Yenko or something like that. Not like Camaros and all that. But this car is so special to me because I always thought, man, that's cool. It's like a mini Chevelle, and it's not a Camaro. But underneath it, it uses the same parts as a Camaro. Everything but the body is basically Camaro. A lot of the wiring and all that actually is pretty similarly set up to a Camaro. The subframe in the front is a Camaro subframe. My subframe supposedly came out of a '69 Camaro because it was crashed at one point. I think I might have mentioned that before too. And everything is the same. It just uses different bolt holes for the core support or something like that. I don't know. I can't remember. But the way I found out about the Chevy Nova is from my father. And like I said, today is a good day to talk about it. It is Father's Day. And I'm actually on my way to go spend some time with my family for Father's Day. And my father won't be there. I actually lost my father several months before I got this car. But I never would have known about the Chevy Nova without him. If it weren't for my father, I would not have this car. All right. So, pretty much done with the Father's Day festivities and all that. So what I was talking about before about the fact that I wouldn't have this car if it weren't for my father. And I mean that in a very literal way. I didn't even know that Chevy Novas existed. Until my dad told me about them when I was young. Now, the context of that was I knew what a Mustang was. I more or less knew what a Camaro was. I knew what a Corvette was, stuff like that. I'd seen, Thunderbirds and Barracudas and all the big name things that even people that aren't into cars really, they probably know what those cars are. Now, as a kid, you always say, oh, one day I'm going to have this car or that car. There's actually an old home video of me telling my aunt or whoever it was that was filming, one day I'm going to own a Viper for sure. I don't really want a Viper, knowing what I know now about Vipers. It's not really my kind of car. They're pretty crazy cars. They're pretty cool, but I just don't want one anymore. And, I've had a couple Mustangs, and I still want an old Mustang. But back in the day, I was in a junior Toastmasters group, which, if you don't know what Toastmasters is, it's a system of learning how to public speak, like give speeches and addresses and such. And it's a program that you can sign up for and learn how to give speeches and all that, and write them and give them. It gives you both. And there's a junior version of that. It originally was for adults, because that's actually the number one, or actually there's been several polls over the years, and it's been found that actually most people, most adults, typical people, actually fear public speaking more than death. And it was ranked higher than dying in greatest fears of people. And my parents entered, me and a few of my siblings in this program years back, and we did it for years. And one of the speeches, they give you different ones. They give you, you have to use one where you have to use a lot of articulation and hand gestures, one where you have to have visual aids. And I think this was one of the visual aid speeches. And I decided to do it on cars. I'd always been interested in cars, and I was like, what, I'm going to do mine on muscle cars, because I was just really starting to kind of get into older cars, and really cars that I was interested in maybe one day owning. And so when I was researching, stuff for this speech, I would talk to my dad about it because him and his brothers, he was one of 8 boys, all boys. Bless my grandmother. Him and his brothers were more into cars than he was. They had the cars that they worked on and all that. My dad had a few cars over the years that were cool. He had an old Vega, and he had an old Celica at one point. Just got passed by a Hyundai. That's what I get for trying to talk and drive, right? Anyways, his brothers were more of what you would call car guys, but my dad was always interested in cars. So I didn't grow up around cars as such, but I really, really got interested in them toward the end of high school. And especially, that's when I first got my first car was when I started college. About a year and a half into college is when I first got my first car, my Datsun. I'll talk about that in a later video, maybe. I'll have to talk about all my old cars. I've had a lot. But when I was writing this speech, I was asking my dad about, like, what kind of cars do you like? What kind of old classic muscle cars do you like? And he said, well, Camaros and all that are cool. Chevelles are cool. But my favorite was always the Nova. And I was like, what's that? What's a Chevy Nova? And he's like, check it out. It's really cool. It's kind of like a smaller version of a Chevelle or something. And I looked it up, and I fell in love. The first time I saw a 3rd gen Nova, that's 68 to 74. Namely, the early 3rd gen, which is the 68 to 72, which has different rear quarter windows and smaller bumpers. That's what this car is, 71. And I loved it instantly. And I was like, I want one of those one day. And, the first few years of college, I would look at Novas and I would think, I wish I could find one that I could get. And they were always too expensive, or they were the wrong year. I really wanted, an earlier one because they had better engines, and the later ones had a bunch of smog stuff, and they cut compression for unleaded fuel in 1971 and up. So the original engine in this car, even if it were a 350, probably wouldn't have made any more power, if I'm honest. And this car does not make a lot of power. This only makes about 265 horsepower. It makes truck torque, but it's not amazing. It's not fast. But after my father passed away in 2014, I actually had a different car. And like I said, I'll talk about my old cars in a different video sometime. But I was looking at selling the car maybe and getting something else because there wasn't a whole lot of parts for the other car. And I wanted something that I could really build, something that I could get a lot of parts for much more easily, and something I was happier owning, something that I was more interested in. And long story short, a family friend made a deal with me, and he helped me get this car. I can't say that he straight up, paid for everything on the car, but it was kind of like a half and half deal. He would pay for some stuff, I would pay for part of the car and some parts and such, and in return I would help him, help his son learn about cars. And his son actually helped me put the front suspension in his car. He came over a few times and we did a bunch of work on it and all that, and and the deal was that I would pay him back for helping his son. And I've been doing that the last couple of years. I've been paying him back every month. And if it weren't for him, and he was close with my dad, was the reason that, he approached me about all this, because he knew I was into cars. His son said he wanted to get into cars. And he got really, really close with my dad the last year that he was alive. And it was the most surreal thing. The day that I bought this car and drove it home, I parked it and I kind of turned around and looked at it, And maybe I'll put the picture, the first picture I took of the car, you know, here. It was a damp day. The car had drag radials on it when I picked it up. And it was wet roads, and the thing was just sliding all over the place. It had no front sway bar. It had skinny front tires. And it was just a riot. Now, the car is much, much different from that day. It's basically the entire front end is different. Everything that wasn't the frame rails, basically, and the suspension and the steering and the wheels and tires and brakes, all in the front are all completely different now. The rear end's the same, it's just different wheels and tires. It's got a different transmission in it. It's got a different carburetor on it. I added power steering to it. Just clearing out the carbon, right? Anyways, the car drives completely different from how it used to. It had no power steering. I can't talk. No power steering. The steering box was basically broken. It had like a full quarter turn of play in the steering. It had drag front suspension. Like I said, no sway bar and skinny tires, so it didn't corner at all. And it had an automatic, but man, could that thing foot brake launch like no other. That was a whole lot of fun. Now I got a 4-speed. I painted the cage white. You know, I'll have to show you later, but I messed with the front end a little bit on the headlights. Got some fun stuff on there. I might show that in the video too. And I'm happy with it. It's a lot of fun. I've always taken steps to improve how it drives and such. I finally got the brake style. That was one thing that was kind of the only letdown over the course of the build, so to speak, was when I put the new brakes on it, they didn't seem to work properly, and I was a little concerned about that, but I've since got them dialed in, and I know exactly what it needed and the last of what it needs here. Sorry if it's a little loud and a little wobbly. I know my roll cage isn't gusseted into the chassis, so it does flex a little bit. And like I said, I wanted to talk about how this car made me feel and what it really means to me. And there's just nothing like having an old car that you put literal blood, sweat, and tears into, done a bunch of work to, and you can call it your own, and it's a dream car of yours. It's unique, and it makes me happy every time that I drive it, and every time I drive it, it reminds me of my dad. And I miss my dad, but I love him. And, you know, I shed my tears for him years ago. And not in a bad way, but I haven't shed any tears since. Not for him. I know he's in a better place now than he was on the earth. And my family's grown closer and more, you know, just together ever since then. And I've changed a lot myself. I learned so much working on this car. I did my first, you know, suspension overhaul, my first set of assembling brakes, my first transmission swap. Later this year, I hope to do my second engine swap, my first LS swap. And every time I look at this car, I gotta pinch myself and remind myself, yeah, that thing's mine. Even though it's not a whole lot to look at, it's not very fast. It's not like it handles the best at all, but it is mine. It's unique. It makes me happy. And that's what cars are about. That's really the point of being a car guy. That's what car culture is about, is sharing a passion that's really our own. It's unlike any other hobby on the planet. You know, cars can be an appliance, they can be a toy, they can be a tool. And for me, it's just a part of my life. It's a part of my identity. And just nothing else comes close.